Okay, here we are, that long awaited day, the last day of our class. So I hope you're all doing well, and I'm going to dive into this and plow through it as painlessly as possible. And then I'll hang around for any questions you might have afterwards. So today is our last class, just so we all know. I see a number of you have already submitted the final essay. I haven't had time to start grading yet, but I promise I will this weekend. If you need a few more days, it's cool because I don't have time to grade yet. So today we're talking about neoliberalism from the chapter 11 of John Chastain's Born in Blood and Fire, our book this semester. And so neoliberalism is neoliberalism basically is classical liberalism on steroids. So whenever you see neo in front of something, it means like neoconservatism is new conservatism. Neoliberalism is new liberalism. And it usually means retreaded or recycled or maybe updated in some way, but basically the same thing. And so liberalism in the 19th century of Latin America meant limited government, economic laissez-faire, separation of church and state, personal freedoms and personal rights. And so neoliberalism is a fresh round or a new season of re-emphasis of liberal ideas. Again, we're not talking in terms of U.S. political liberalism in the U.S. political sense is somewhat different than what we're talking about with classical liberalism. So this is a larger, more historical and international use of the word liberalism, referring to the core principles of liberalism. The fact is that with the internet and with modern technology, it opens up all kinds of possibilities for free trade, for economic laissez-faire between countries, and there's a whole lot of complications that come with this new round of liberalism. And part of the reason for the this period called neoliberalism in Latin America was the end of the Cold War. So we had 1948 through 1989, almost 40 years of Cold War between the West and the East, capitalism and communism, the U.S. and the Soviet Union, liberalism versus collectivism, and we won, apparently. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1989. That doesn't mean that there was no more communism, because you still have Cuba and China and Vietnam. But even in places like China and Vietnam, they started to retool themselves to be able to be communist in government philosophy, but to participate in the capitalist market economically. I don't know quite how they did that, but somehow they made it work, and they're doing pretty good with it, at least up until recently. So the Cold War came to an end. A guy, a political scientist by the name of Francis Fukuyama, wrote a essay called "The End of History," and his idea, which turned out ultimately to be mistaken, was that history was over. The liberalism, Western classical liberalism, won. Communism was defeated, and now there's no more history because there's no more enemies. It's just clear sailing from here on, and greater prosperity. And of course, that was in, I think he wrote that in maybe 1994 or something like that, quite a bit before 9/11 and the World Trade Towers collapsing. And so we ended up finding new enemies. The Soviet Union was no longer an enemy, but then we had a war on drugs in the 1990s. And beginning with September 11th, 2001, we started a war on terror. I just was talking about that in my other class in American history. So this is the era of neoliberalism, new liberalism, a new re-emphasis on these liberal ideals that were tried out in Latin America. They were attempted in various periods in the 19th century and worked with mixed success. And if you remember, there was a period, neocolonialism, where there was a lot of free trade, and Latin America ended up exporting its raw materials, agricultural commodities, and for a while that was profitable. But in the end, it didn't bring prosperity to Latin America or economic industrial development. So this is kind of like a repeat of that period, but again on steroids, amped up with the internet, the internet happened to develop in the early 1990s, about the same time as the end of the Cold War, and the World Wide Web, and email, and all these things brought about a huge amount of social change. So the political ideology that accompanies capitalism is liberalism. It returned to favor everywhere in the post-Cold War Latin America. And I've already said most of this. The doctrine of comparative advantage, export production, emphasis on free trade, all these ideas reigned supreme in Latin America in the 1990s. And as usual, they end up pushing it too far. So this is neoliberal economies during this time period, and this is the GDP per capita. So per capita means per person, per head. So in the United States, the average person was making $36,900 GDP. Your individual portion of the gross domestic product in the United States was 36,000. Mexico, it was almost 6,000. Colombia, is that possible? 1,700. That's a lot less than Mexico. Argentina, a little bit over 3,000. Uruguay, the same thing. How about Costa Rica? Costa Rica is pretty prosperous, 5,000. I mean, that's a lot less than the United States. But these are neoliberal economies in the 1990s. So this idea basically had no competition. Fernando Henrique Cardoso was a Brazilian sociologist. He was a Marxist. He was in one of the universities in Brazil, and he got tapped to be the Minister of Economics in Brazil in the early 1990s when there was accelerating inflation. And they tried everything to stop it. Nothing was slowing down the hyperinflation in Brazil. So they hired him to come in, and he implemented a plan of stabilization. They reinvented the currency. They cut government employment. They cut subsidies. They basically tightened their belt. And his plan was successful. They were able to bring inflation from very high levels. I don't know how high. Do you remember? Do you know?
I wasn't alive, but my dad was. He was used to say that like at 9 in the morning the price was like 10. If you go like a full PM, it would be like 15. It was like crazy stuff. It was the daily inflation.
It was like, I don't have the numbers, but it went like from 900%, and they brought it down over a couple of years to a reasonable level of inflation. None of us know what that would be like. I mean, right now everybody's upset, and I'm upset. My mortgage went up, my association fee went up. It's all going up. However, it's not going up 900% or even 100%. 100% means everything doubles. And so we have mild inflation right now, and it hurts. It hurts the poor or the working class, especially because your income's not going up. But in Brazil, it was out of control, and they tapped him. He came in. He addressed the problem. He was elected as the president of Brazil because of his success. He was elected president in 1994, but he was not able to. He didn't govern Brazil as a Marxist. It just wasn't possible with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. It's one thing to be a Marxist in the university. It's another thing when you're trying to tame inflation. You feel me? I see that hand. And so he basically he disappointed some of his leftist followers, but he mutated over to a neoliberal from a Marxist in the university. Here's some pictures I like of cities in Latin America, urban development, especially. I like this one of Rio de Janeiro. It's one of my favorite cities in the world. I think this one is Mexico City. So you see huge urban conglomerations, which means huge problems to manage. The problem with neoliberalism, neoliberal development, is that it created very unequal economic growth. So if you were effective with neoliberal economic policies, the affluent would do well. Those that had money would prosper. The middle class would be stable, and the poor would suffer. So you had a situation of a chasm growing between the wealthy and the poor. The rich get richer and the poor get poorer, is an old saying. And that's certainly true in many cases in a neoliberal economy. It does bring development. It does bring prosperity, but not to everyone equally. And so one of the problems that Latin America entered into during this time period was a debt crisis. In order to develop an industry, you had to have tractors and heavy equipment and railroads, and you have to have universities to train people to engineers to do these things. And to do all that requires capital investment. And in Latin America, there was a shortage of capital investment. So they had to borrow the money to invest it. In the 1980s, Latin American countries struggled with payments on foreign debt. Brazil and Mexico were overwhelmed with their debt. Yes.
Most of those debts were mainly gave to Latin American countries during military dictatorships, right? The U.S. would give, and that's correct, right?
Well, let me think for a minute. No, I think most of the military dictatorships ended about 1990. 1989, the Brazilian military dictatorship ended and they returned to democracy. And pretty much in Argentina and everywhere else, even in Chile, there was a return to democracy about the same time as this neoliberal period.
Yeah, but I mean
the loaning.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, because that's probably true. In the late 70s and 80s, there were loans to military dictatorships, and so the interest rates went up in the 1980s. There was a Gulf oil crisis. There was a war between Israel and some of its neighbors, which caused Saudi Arabia and others to form OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Producing Countries. And in order to punish the West for supporting Israel, they cut back on oil production. This was in the late 70s, I think. And I remember sitting in long lines for hours at gas stations trying to get gas. I remember mortgages going up to 9 or 10% interest. That's a lot for a house mortgage. So this was in the early 1980s, about the time Reagan was elected. And of course, when the interest rates go up, what happens to government debt? The government has to pay more for interest rates. That's the U.S. government or any other government. So if the government ends up paying twice as much on interest on a heavy foreign debt, that means that it's going to create a problem. And so the difference between the U.S. national debt and Latin American debt was very simple. The Latin American debts were external to foreign banks. The U.S. debt was mostly internal. That means that American citizens were the debt holders of bonds and so on. And so the U.S. could print money and print more money, which then that leads to inflation, but it also keeps the cash flow going. Latin American countries couldn't really do that. I mean, they could print more money, but their debt still had to be paid to the International Monetary Fund, IMF. So the external debts went from 105 billion in 1976, that would be the era of military dictatorships, to about almost 400 billion. Let's round it off. In 1986, with Mexico and Brazil owning the most. So it went from 100 to 400 billion. That's a lot. So this brings in the notorious International Monetary Fund. This is an international organization. Many would say that it works on behalf of the United States and Great Britain and the G20 nations. And many of the developing nations complain about it because the International Monetary Fund would come in and loan more money and restructure the debt so that it would bring down the payments and make it easier for Mexico or Brazil to make the payments. But in the long run, they're going to be paying more. Just like if you refinance the debt on your house, you may be able to bring the mortgage payments down, but you have to extend it from 20 years to 30 years. And you end up at 30 years paying a lot more. Well, they did this in a lot of countries, but usually the IMF would insist, and this is reasonable, you can see why they would do this, they would insist on belt tightening techniques. So if you are Mexico and you have a huge federal bureaucracy of people working for the federal government, and you have to restructure your debt with the IMF, they would insist you have to lay off 10% of your federal workforce, or 15%, which cuts spending. But what else does it do? It creates unemployment. And so also Argentina or Mexico or Brazil might be subsidizing transportation. So you can catch a trolley car for 5 reais, but actually the real cost would be a lot more if the government wasn't subsidizing it. And so, and this was a big deal in Venezuela a few years ago because Venezuela subsidized food, it subsidized electric, and a lot of that came from the oil wealth. But then when Venezuela hit some rough sailing with its finances, it had to cut back, and that created a problem for the poor who were dependent on the electricity and the food subsidies in Venezuela. Same thing in Cuba. Cuba is going through major economic problems right now that I've heard, and part of it, it's forced them to cut back on their, is it subsidies? There's another word for it, I think. You can, La Libreta in Cuba, you have a little booklet, you can go get free coffee, free food, small amounts that's guaranteed to you. But what happens when you run out?
Like food stamps, right?
Pardon?
Like food stamps.
Yeah. Well, much more than food stamps. Food stamps, you can buy coffee at a discount, but in Cuba you get X amount of coffee for free for the month. It's not very much. I was there one time in the early '90s during the special period, and my host fixed me Cafe Cubano, and it was really good. I'm used to drinking a pot of coffee every morning, so I asked if I could have another one. And I drank up his entire month's coffee in one morning, like a dumb gringo. And I felt bad. Of course, I went out and bought some coffee, tourist coffee, and replaced it. So this financial system was called the Washington Consensus. Why might it be called the Washington Consensus? Well, number one, it was a consensus. The Soviet Union is gone. Everybody's in agreement now that capitalism works better than communism, at least almost everybody. Even the Chinese are starting to become capitalists. And the former Russian Soviet system they're all reinvesting and privatizing. And so the Washington Consensus is, okay, this works, and all the other stuff doesn't work. That was the thinking. But it didn't work for some countries. Brazil and Mexico defaulted on their loans. They couldn't pay them. And then eventually the other thing that IMF insists on, if you're going to restructure your loans, is cuts in social spending. So if you have social programs that are designed as a safety net to help the poor, the very poor, IMF said, no, you got to cut that. You can't afford that. You're trying to economize here. You can't afford to be giving away free money. Well, what does that lead to? That leads to social upheaval. What year was it that the Copa America or the World Cup was in Brazil?
2014.
Say it again. 2014. I think there were some riots in Brazil right after that or around that time. There was some transportation subsidies that were cut.
Oh, every month, I think.
Yeah. So you cut social spending, and it sounds like a good idea in theory, except for you got a lot of hungry people or sick people, and you have social upheaval. People then can take to the streets and start protesting. And so then you have to have the military to put people back in line. So it's like a vicious cycle. And so it was very successful in cutting inflation, yes.
Do you know what is the IMF position towards public universities? Or they don't have like that?
No, I don't know, but I'm sure they would be more favorable to the U.S. system of socking it to the students and charging you a lifetime worth of debt in order to go to school than for the government to pay for it. That's my assumption.
Yeah. All right, that's my assumption.
Bernie Sanders would like to make it free. I don't know if that's realistic either.
Brazil has free schools. Argentina has free schools. A bunch of countries which doesn't have as much money as U.S. has. And we also have like free healthcare. We also have got a lot of other things. We also have a bigger dab, right? But
Let's move to Brazil. Okay, let me rush through this because we're going to run out of time, and I don't have another chance next week to do this. So, NAFTA and Mercosur. Does anyone know what these are? I know a couple of you do. NAFTA is a North American free trade area or agreement. It's between Mexico, Canada, and the United States. And I don't want to go in detail on this. I did in my last class. But basically, it creates a free trade area where there's no, what do they call them? No, when you charge import taxes. There's another word for it, import tariffs. And in theory, this makes everything work better. This is neoliberalism or liberalism on steroids. Let's just get rid of all the taxes, get rid of the regulation, get rid of the tariffs, and let everybody trade freely, and everybody will prosper. All the water rises and all boats will rise. And it sounds good in theory, unless you are a poor Mexican farmer with only 5 acres of land and maybe a broken tractor or a horse that you pulls your plow, and you raise enough corn to take it into the nearby village and sell it, and you survive on your small farm that way. But with NAFTA, now it gets rid of the tariffs on U.S. corn. And so a guy who's basically a millionaire who operates a 5,000 acre farm in Iowa and has $100,000 tractors can raise his corn, mass produced, so to speak, and sell it to Mexico. And it finally gets to your village cheaper than you can raise your hand grown corn with tender loving care in your small plot of land. And so what do? You end up having to sell your land and go to work in a factory, or worse, you end up homeless. So that's some of the dislocations that come with this globalization. And after NAFTA was inaugurated in 1994 under Bill Clinton, then Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, and Uruguay started their own free market area in the southern cone of the South America called Mercosur. And the idea, I remember there was a guy over at DM. There was a big office called the Free Trade of the Americas. And this is when I started here in 2003. The idea was that NAFTA was going to just grow, and we're going to bring in other countries in Central America and eventually South America, and pretty soon the whole American hemisphere would be one big free trade zone with no tariffs, where things could flow and trade freely, and they called it the Summit of the Americas, and they had a whole big office. They had some money, and secretary, and then a few years later it was gone. It was in fact, it ended up becoming my office when I was a director of academic programs, because it was a dream, but it was very idealistic, and it just didn't work out the way people expected. For one thing, you could be Ross Perot was a wealthy billionaire in Houston, Texas, who ran against George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton in 1994. And I'm not sure I can do a Texas accent, but he said, "When you hear that giant sucking sound, that's jobs going south to Mexico." That was a very poor imitation. If I had the time, I'd pull him up on YouTube and play him for you. But he was the last independent candidate that may have swung an election. Probably Bill Clinton won the election instead of George H.W. Bush because H. Ross Perot was running against globalization. And he was actually right in many ways, because he said that jobs in Dearborn, Michigan, building Ford trucks, the workers are getting paid $25, $30 an hour. They have health care. They have a pension plan. They have union protection. There's environmental regulation. There's OSHA, which is Office of Safety and Hazards. And so you trade that in. If you're the owner of Ford or Chevy or whatever, and you want to make as much money as possible, there's a limit to how much you can sell those trucks for. So the next thing you do is look for what you can cut. So what can you cut? You move now, because there's no tariffs, you can move your Ford assembly plant to Tijuana or Juarez, and you can hire young single women in the maquiladora, they called them, to come in and do the work with no health care, no pension plan, no protections, no environmental regulation, and pay them $5 a day instead of $30 an hour. So you can make more money on that truck. And this is what H. Ross Perot ran against in 1994, protesting the idea of NAFTA. Now, I'm not saying it's a bad idea entirely. I'm just saying, I'm pointing out some of the problems with it. So this is where we get the Rust Belt, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and some of these states where people are living in towns that used to have factories and used to have assembly plants, and now they're gone, and the children are leaving to go look for decent jobs in big cities, and people are angry and resentful about this whole process of globalization, which they blame, and rightly so, both of the Bushes and Bill Clinton, and maybe to some extent Obama, all the presidents from about 1990 up through 2008, 2012 were bought into this idea of globalization, neoliberalism. This is one of the things that the new right in the Republican Party, and I'm not giving an opinion here. I'm going to observe a fact. There's a kind of a rising tide of nationalism, America first, and it's partly a reaction to this, the disappointment that came with globalization, poverty, unemployment, people losing jobs for $30 an hour in a manufacturing plant and having to go to Walmart and work for minimum wage. You see what happens there. And so this is the downside of neoliberalism. So the current free market growth seems to make the rich richer, the middle class more middle class, and the poor comparatively poorer. When I was living when I spent a summer in Rio de Janeiro studying Portuguese, and I've mentioned this to you before, but on my way to language class in the morning, I would practically be stepping over bodies on the sidewalk of homeless people who were asleep, had no place to sleep, and they were sleeping on the sidewalk. And it's the downside of neoliberal unequal development. some people are really making some bank off of it, but other people are wind up homeless. And that just is the way it is. So I think I'm going to stop there. There's more in here. I hope you'll maybe take a moment and look at the PowerPoint that I've uploaded to week 15. It talks about the pink tide. Pink tide was a backlash against neoliberalism and the Washington Consensus that began around 2002 with the election of Lula in Brazil, which I'm sure you're very familiar with that, and a reaction against the kind of the seamy side of neoliberalism, or the unintended problems. And then you had several other countries that tilted towards the left. It's called the pink tide because it's not red is the color that was associated with communism, Marxism, Soviet Union. And so this was not entirely communist, but it was leaning that way. So they call it pink. So you had Venezuela's Hugo Chavez on the left here. Evo Morales was an indigenous labor leader in Bolivia that was elected president of Bolivia. Lula was a labor leader in Brazil, elected president of Brazil after running for president 4 times, I think. And then Rafael Correa in Ecuador was another member of the Pink Tide. This is a meeting in 2008 in Manaus. And so this led to a upsurge of negative reaction to the Washington Consensus. And of course, what was going on in the United States at this time, it was also after 9/11. President Bush came into office, the son, President George W. Bush, the son, came into office having been governor of Texas, having had good relationship with the neighboring governor in Mexico. He spoke some Spanish, not as much as his brother Jeb, but he did speak some Spanish. He came into office and was determined to make Latin America his top priority in terms of foreign policy. And that lasted just a few months. And that's when the airplanes hit the Twin Towers and the Pentagon, and the terrorist act carried out by Al Qaeda happened in September 11th, 2001. And that completely changed the thinking. Latin America was forgotten about, and now the agenda was the war on terror. And so this created a vacuum. Washington wasn't even thinking about Latin America. So obviously in this vacuum, there's going to be people are going to step into that vacuum. And so the new left, or the pink tide, stepped into that vacuum. The exceptions were Colombia and Mexico, which I won't go into, but Colombia's President Alvaro Uribe took a hard line against the guerrilla insurgents in Colombia. And in Mexico, they had an uprising against NAFTA with the Zapatistas. And so Mexico and Colombia were 2 exceptions. They tended to move to the right instead of to the left. Of course, it helped that Colombia was getting several $1 billion from the United States every year. That money talks, bullshit walks. So that is my story, and I'm sticking to it. And where is the off button here? Hold on one second. Well, that's odd. I thought I knew how to do this. Nope. Okay, I'll just have to let it go. Any comments or questions? Any questions about assignments? Yes.
When you say it is the last day that opens all the signs are closed.
Well, in theory, the last day. I'm having a problem here with my technology. Hold on a second. I'm not good at multitasking. I'm just going to have to shut it down. Nothing else is working. Okay. So the last day is next Friday. Switch user, sign out.